Like the content you see? Support this channel on Patreon. Link in the description.
Anakin, training to become a Jedi is not an easy challenge. And even if you succeed, it's a hard life.
The Jedi Path was a truly arduous affair, but also rewarding and enlightening. From selection, to finding a master, to the construction of a lightsaber, and to the Jedi trials themselves. Each step of a Padawan's training was a lesson not just for the Order, but for the Force itself. A Jedi's apprenticeship was perhaps the most important step in their career, as one discovered who they truly were in the Force, their strengths, and their weaknesses. 3 such Padawans would go through very different tests, culminating themselves into very different individuals with their own perceptions of what it meant to serve the Force.
Obi-Wan is ready.
I am ready to face the trials.
He is headstrong, and he has much to learn of the living Force, but he is capable. There is little more he can learn from me.
Like most infants with an affinity to use the Force, Obi-Wan Kenobi was taken to the Jedi Temple at a very young age. Instead of a mother and a father, he was raised by a village of Jedi Knights and Masters. Instead of blood-related siblings, his brothers and sisters were his fellow Jedi prospects. But unlike a traditional family, Kenobi's new kin taught him the ways of the Force. As a Jedi initiate, Kenobi's fighting skill grew and grew. An early growth spurt made him one of the biggest, strongest, and fiercest fighters in his clan. But his talent was hindered by anger and fear. Where there was much growth in his physical form, there was much to be desired in his growth with the Force. Because of this lack of control, Obi-Wan was not selected to become a Jedi Apprentice, and was instead sent to the Jedi Service Corps on Bondamir. Fortunately, a Jedi Master named Qui-Gon Jinn was assigned to the planet on a mission and was attacked by a criminal organization led by Xanatos, his former student. Obi-Wan helped him to subvert the Dark Jedi's plans, and from that point on, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi became Master and Apprentice. Throughout the years, they went on many missions together. Notable examples: their uprooting of Xanatos' criminal plans, participation in the Stark Hyperspace War, and, of course, the occupation of Naboo. It was here that Kenobi would face and defeat his first Sith, Darth Maul, though his master fell to their opponent's blade. The encounter was his final Jedi trial, his final test. Finally, by the approval of Grandmaster Yoda and the Council, Obi-Wan Kenobi was a Jedi Knight of the Republic.
Unorthodox young Skywalker's career has been. So too will be his trials. Trust in the Force, I do. A knight he shall be.
Many years before there was an Obi-Wan Kenobi, or even a Grandmaster Yoda, or perhaps even before the Jedi of the Old Republic, there was a prophecy of a chosen one who would destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force. It has been speculated on how and why this chosen one was born, but it was likely due to the manipulation of the Force by the Sith Lord, Darth Plagueis, who was pursuing eternal life. Some would say that the Force itself retaliated to this corruption, and a miracle occurred. A young woman named Shmi gave birth to a son, with no father. The boy was named Anakin Skywalker. Unfortunately, Anakin's mother was a slave, and at the age of 3, they were both sold to Gardulla the Hutt on Tatooine. For years, Anakin dreamed of leaving the planet, becoming a famous pilot or even a Jedi Knight, something that would let him venture the galaxy, away from the uninspiring sands of the desert planet. At the age of 9, by chance, or by will of the Force, Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn discovered young Skywalker on a simple repair run. Sensing the boy's high concentration of Force sensitivity, Jinn freed the boy and took him to the Jedi Temple, where he was eventually trained under Obi-Wan Kenobi. Many Jedi suspected that he was indeed the prophesied chosen one. The Sith were on the rise, he was born to no father, and had an aptitude with the Force even greater than Master Yoda. But Anakin's training was turbulent. The other students resented him. Masters were not quite sure how to instruct him, and Anakin was not sure where he fit in the Order, and more broadly, the galaxy itself. Anakin's Jedi career was unusual and rushed, but his talent with the Force was unmatched by any of his peers, even by some of the Knights and Masters. But young Skywalker was headstrong and reckless. This thoughtless mentality is what led to his arm being cut off by Count Dooku, or falling into Asajj Ventress's trap during the start of the Clone War. Even so, his gifts could not be denied. Where a traditional trainee might have been denied knighthood, or even an apprenticeship, the growing conflict between the Republic and the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and the growing dark cloud of the Sith, forced the Jedi's hand, prematurely promoting Anakin as a Jedi Knight.
You have shown such great strength and resilience in your struggle to prove your innocence.
This is the true sign of a Jedi Knight.
This was actually your great trial.
Back into the Order. You may come.
33 years before the Battle of Yavin, on a standard mission to the planet Sheely, Jedi Master Plo Koon discovered an individual with a natural gift of the Force. The young Togruta was named Ahsoka Tano, and like most Force users in Republic space, she lived out her childhood on Coruscant within the Jedi Temple. Like many initiates, much of her training was under the guidance of Grandmaster Yoda. Over the years, she impressed the Master Jedi, and mere months into the Clone Wars, Ahsoka was assigned to the infamous Anakin Skywalker. Tano was a product of her time. Like her new master, her promotion to Padawan was prematurely prompted by the Clone War, as more and more Jedi were needed, not only because of the droid army, but because of enemies like General Grievous, Asajj Ventress, and the bounty hunters of the galaxy. But there was a second part to Yoda's pairing of Skywalker and Tano, and the lesson was meant for Anakin, who Yoda felt needed to learn a greater sense of responsibility in lieu of his accelerated advancement. The duo went on many missions together, Ahsoka making a prominent name for herself throughout her many battles. Unlike her master, Ahsoka played situations closer to the book, but she also learned that certain situations needed a more proactive, Anakin-esque approach. In a way, she was the balance and culmination of Anakin's brash vigor and Obi-Wan's respectable consideration. Many of her missions were led by the two of them, and the lessons they both imparted colored her development. However, near the Clone Wars' end, just before Ahsoka's potential knighting, she stepped away from the Jedi. Tried for crimes committed by her friend Barriss Offee, Tano felt betrayed by the Jedi Order, deciding that she should walk her own path in the Force. For this video, I will be examining these characters as they appear in the Star Wars canon and Legends continuity. For Obi-Wan Kenobi, I will be examining him up until The Phantom Menace, utilizing Legends material like the Dark Horse comics and the Jedi Apprentice series. For Anakin Skywalker, I will be examining him up until Clone Wars Chapter 21, using Legends material like the Dark Horse comics and the Jedi Quest series. For Ahsoka Tano, I will be examining her up until Season 5 of the Clone Wars, also using Legends material like the comics and sourcebooks. For those of you who are scratching your head, yes, I am using each character as they were as Padawans. As described in The Rising Force, Obi-Wan's greatest strength was his largest weakness. At the age of 13, he went through a tremendous growth spurt, making him one of the strongest and biggest initiates in his clan. However, this growth came much too sudden, and he developed a reputation for being clumsy and unbalanced. But after being trained by Qui-Gon Jinn, it would seem that Kenobi partially corrected this issue, particularly through his application of Taijutsu. Yet Kenobi's balance was exploited by the likes of Darth Maul, a much more skilled fighter, as described in the Phantom Menace novelization. Like many young Jedi, he had a particular fancy for augmenting his physical abilities with the Force, making use of more flamboyant leaps and somersaults to combat his enemies, sometimes with a little too much zealous. Kenobi coupled this with his respectable amount of strength, brutalized by Beast and taking a 50-yard fall like a champ. He can also dole out pain where necessary, notably against Darth Maul in their initial engagement. But Kenobi hardly used his physical abilities in a way that subverted his opponent's own. It's almost like what you see with rookie athletes, who simply overwhelm their opponents with their sheer talent, speed, or strength, whereas the more experienced players know when to employ their physical advantage at the right time. During Obi-Wan's apprenticeship, he flung himself at his opponent, sometimes overextending himself and opening himself up to attack. But it's also worth noting that this same talent is what allows him to contend and land hard-hitting blows to begin with. Anakin Skywalker was much the same, very flashy, overzealous, and all talent. But Skywalker was all the more tenacious for it. Anakin always had remarkable reflexes. As a child, he was the only human to successfully pod race, not only surviving, but winning. These attributes only increased when he was trained as a Jedi, and his physical talents were a sight to behold. Obi-Wan even likened Anakin's speed to those of Jedi Masters when Anakin was only a teenager, and this would later be validated by Anakin's contention with the Great Count Dooku, where, for a time, Dooku could do nothing but dodge. The young Jedi gave him no measure for counterattack. But this would also be Anakin's weakness, as he expended too much energy. Like Padawan Kenobi, he overextended himself, opening himself up to attack, or falling to fatigue. That said, Anakin, when not met with a lightsaber, was capable of tanking a counter-assault, simply soaking in the damage that got past his guard. He was one of the few Jedi to survive the grueling Battle of Jabim, and was one of 2 apprentices to survive the Battle of Geonosis, and he could utilize his sheer might to break through an opponent's defense. Padawan Anakin was a far cry from the knight he would eventually become, but the foundations of his physicality were rock solid. Though she was shorter than Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker, as a teenage Togruta, Ahsoka Tano had a lot of dexterity. In combat, she favored flips and speedy dodges over strength-based attacks, often using acrobatics to outmaneuver her opponents. By way of her force augmentation, she could bolster her agility, becoming a whirlwind of combative speed and swift evasion. Some of her leaps and bounds even rivaled that of knights and masters. Ahsoka's natural biology also boosted her senses. Her head tails allowed her to sense movements and sound waves, something her ancestors used when hunting on their homeworld. Though I call the effectiveness of this ability in question, and take it with a grain of salt, especially after her fight with Barriss Offee, where she was surprised by several attacks. Still, after speaking with Great Jedi 91, I feel much of Ahsoka's spatial awareness is attributed more to her Jedi training than her natural biology. And that's not to say that Ahsoka was not spatially aware, as evident in her fight against a band of Mandalorians. Tano coupled her agility with a skillful use of hand-to-hand martial arts, fighting against enemies who were much stronger than she was. She achieves this through sheer speed, whether fighting against clone troopers or nasty Trandoshans. All in all, Ahsoka's youthful dexterity and natural biology, coupled with her force perception and force augmentation, made her a more than competent physical opponent. Though Obi-Wan and Anakin had strength advantages over Ahsoka, whether by way of dealing damage or taking it, I do favor the little Togruta. Of the 3, she utilized her physical advantages the best, with the most thoughtful skill. Like any Padawan, it's true she could be a little too energetic, but she honed herself more completely than either Kenobi or Skywalker has shown. Of the 3, she had the most composure with her body, and much more flexibility because of it. That being the case, I still feel Obi-Wan and Anakin wouldn't make a physical bout easy for her. Of the pair, I feel Obi-Wan would fall off first, as Anakin has a bit more speed and strength and constitution by the time of Attack of the Clones, and a respectable balance to use these advantages. And once Anakin focused his attention on Tano, he would make her work for it. But I can see Ahsoka forcing Anakin to overcommit himself while she dances around him, potentially exhausting him, though I find this far less likely as her skill isn't so developed that she could completely wear Skywalker out. Plus, she could end up gassing herself out in the process. But ultimately, I do favor Ahsoka and her capacity to subvert Anakin's superior strength by her own skillful agility. Ahsoka Tano gets the slight edge for her physical abilities. As a Jedi Apprentice, Obi-Wan had a solid connection to the Force, though as an initiate, he had a hard time allowing it to flow through him. As an adult, he had an easier time perceiving the unifying Force, sensing an elusive danger during the blockade of Naboo. But Qui-Gon would criticize his hardship with the living Force, particularly against Darth Maul. This may also extend to Kenobi's use of beast manipulation, and on a more advanced level, the Jedi mind trick, which he never showed an ability for prior to his knighthood. Clearly, Kenobi became highly proficient in both as he advanced as a Jedi Master. But as a Padawan, he still had much training to go through with regards to the living Force and its active use. Bearing that in mind, he did have a notable talent for farsight and his general sense powers, as evident in the Phantom Menace and his blindfold challenges in the Jedi Temple. But with regards to his active use of the Force, he was very proficient with his telekinetic abilities, chaining them into his lightsaber movesets. Perhaps his best showings of telekinesis were during the Phantom Menace, where he and Maul briefly battled in a telekinetic match, throwing objects at one another, though ultimately, Obi-Wan's Force barriers were penetrated, and his defensive efforts with the Force had been overwhelmed before, even with the help of Quinlan Vos. It's also worth noting the difficulty of Kenobi's kill move against Darth Maul, where he not only augmented his physical abilities to lift himself with nothing more than an outcropping, but at the same time call his master's lightsaber to his hand and finish with perfect balance in one steady motion. Obi-Wan was not as refined as the Jedi Master he would become. He had a wandering mind, which gave him respectable capabilities with farsight and sense, but left a bit to be desired with his in-the-moment abilities, but he partially rectified this with a solid use of telekinesis. Anakin Skywalker was, by far, the strongest Force user with regards to his raw abilities, exceeding the innate powers of any Jedi before him. Other Force users in his presence made note of this almost immediately, staggered by the sheer power bottled within him. It was one of the motives that denied him to the Jedi, and the reason he was so closely guarded when he was accepted, and the worst part was that Anakin knew it. Despite his training starting many years after most Padawans, within his first year, he already matched most of his peers, and not long after, he was rivaling knights. This quick progression made Anakin incredibly arrogant, even feeling the Jedi were holding him back, which may very well have been valid, as they feared giving Anakin too much power. It was like giving a Tommy gun to a premature adolescent. Even so, Anakin's power was remarkable, and though he was conceited, he still made a commitment to his training, a notable example coming by way of his abilities with beast manipulation. Early in his apprenticeship, he had difficulty calming the mind of a beast, only sensing its rage, yet he proclaimed that he would work on it until he figured it out, which, by Attack of the Clones, he most certainly did. He also had a natural talent with his farsight and sense powers, blessed or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with clear visions of his dying mother, and sensing the immediate danger Padme was in, even a split second before his master. But perhaps his most exceptional skill was his telekinesis. Anakin has displayed great power and control with the ability, whether crashing two separatist dreadnoughts together, or using it more subtly against Count Dooku during their first engagement. Skywalker has also combined his use of the Force with his lightsaber sequences. He has employed the use of a saber throw, which will become his bread and butter during his career. And even as a Padawan, he altered his environment to his advantage, again, much like his dark side counterpart, Darth Vader. This alteration even extended to creative uses of the Force, and he has showcased that he can simply stonewall against telekinetic attacks and retaliate in kind. This aggressive use of the Force would manifest into the dark side power, the Force Choke, which required more focus than the simple Force push, and Anakin, unbeknownst to the Jedi Order, made use of the sinister ability several times. Yet all of this talent came at the price of Anakin's overconfidence, which resulted in lapses of judgment. For all his skill, he has found himself in precarious situations, exploited for his singular focus. Regardless, he has an outstanding talent, coupling his immense potential with skill, even as a Padawan. Ahsoka Tano was highly regarded for her connection to the Force, in particular, her connection to other life forms. Where Anakin was a combative steamroller, Ahsoka was very empathetic. Her levels of telepathy were substantial, able to sense Plo Koon during the Battle of Christophsis, or sensing the emotions of the slaves on Zygeria, or the children captured by Cad Bane. These powers were akin to Leia Organa or Deba Balaba, who also had a talent for Jedi empathy above their other abilities. Ahsoka did have issues with altering other minds through Jedi mind tricks, achieving success, but with difficulty, though she was able to apply the more simplified use of beast control with less effort. And though she was highly empathetic, she has never shown an ability for farsight, but her Force senses were all the more in tune because of said empathy, knowing when a Bothan lied to her, or when Count Dooku and Asajj Ventress arrived on the planet. This extends to her natural biology, which enables her to have enhanced senses and awareness, as shown when she tried to keep up with Obi-Wan and Anakin's practice sequences. Ahsoka made good use of her telekinetic powers as well, especially when it came to integrating the ability with her lightsaber sequences. Oftentimes, Tano would find herself without a weapon, yet she still coped with only the Force as her tool. With a concentrated effort, she could pull down large objects, or even push back an attacking Grievous while under duress. But her greatest strength was her capacity to augment her physical abilities, as previously covered. This was truly her most substantial talent. She was something of a ballerina with the Force, and it wasn't as though her natural biology had anything to do with it. Togrutas were not really known for significant acrobatics, meaning Ahsoka's gift was all her own. And this is all culminated in the Battle of Onderon, where she displayed a burst of speed, coupled with a Force leap, and ending with a controlled use of telekinesis. As Pablo Hidalgo would say, as an adult, Ahsoka Tano will become less impulsive and flashy with her abilities, assuming he's referring to her augmentation, but that does not detract from her intimate use of Force senses, nor her telekinetic control. A battle of the Force between these three will be interesting, but for me, it will be comfortably conclusive. Obi-Wan and Ahsoka had shared sense powers that would enable them to better understand more elusive occurrences, but neither had the aptitude of Anakin in a combative sense, and it's not like Anakin was without his own talent with sensibilities. But in terms of a group dynamic, I feel Obi-Wan would drop first, as he did not have the technique to keep up with Ahsoka's Force augmentation, or Anakin's magnitude and control of the Force. That's not to say that Obi-Wan made terrible use of the Force, it's just that when comparing to these other two, his simple Force pushes do not stack up a majority of the time. With regards to Anakin and Ahsoka, again, I don't see Ahsoka penetrating Anakin's defenses, nor subverting them. And if met with one of Anakin's Force pushes, I don't see her tanking the attack. However, she does have an ability to evade such an assault, but it would only delay the inevitable sledgehammer she would need to meet. And unlike Anakin, who did alter his environment to throw objects against his foes, or stop them with a subtle Force wall, Ahsoka has not displayed that she would do the same. Otherwise, she might be able to briefly close the gap, just as Ventress did against Anakin. But when all is said and done, Anakin would hold the advantage by way of innate power and practice ability. Anakin Skywalker gets the edge for his Force abilities. Among the Jedi initiates, lightsaber dueling was one of the primary tests of ability and willpower. Oftentimes the fight went beyond physical might and was more about one's composure in the Force. When Obi-Wan Kenobi was an apprentice, Yoda made students fight blindfolded to prevent their reliance on natural senses and instead, trust in the Force. In fact, the main tenet of Form 1, Shi-Cho, besides his very basic cadences, was his discipline of letting the Force take over the user. As Kit Fisto would say, he always wanted to fall deeper into Form 1, to become more unpredictable, letting the Force take over the otherwise simplistic movesets. It was a great foundation for all Padawans, especially as they learned to trust the Force to empower their movements, and all Jedi Padawans were required to master the form before advancing. Once Padawans did gather a trust in the Force, what often happened is that they, gorged on it. This is why, more often than not, you see Jedi apprentices skipping the highly technical fencing form of Makashi, or the defensive, yet stealth form of Surisu, instead jumping straight into the fourth form of lightsaber combat, Ataru. Ataru, also known as the aggression form, or the way of the Hawkbat, was a highly kinetic fighting style among the Jedi. Grandmaster Kovan often discouraged it to younger Jedi, as their youthful dexterity, unabated energy, and lack of discipline translated into careless execution of the cadences. But that didn't stop a vast majority of her students and future students of the Order to adopt the form, including Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and Ahsoka Tano. For Obi-Wan, the choice of Ataru may have been less about his youthful vigor and more the influence of his master, who favored the form well into his old age. It's true that Obi-Wan was far more grounded in his use of the form, but he was certainly more bouncy than his master, often integrating the signature flips and flying kicks Ataru was known for. But Kenobi was trained during a time where blaster-wielding foes were the dominant force. As a result, he was also trained in the fifth form, Xian, which was designed for redirecting blaster fire at his adversaries. It was a common style among the Jedi. There were few who were not familiar with the discipline, especially during the time period. But there was a second variant of the fifth form, called Jemso, which was geared more towards strength-based dueling, and was classified as the most physically demanding form. I will not say Obi-Wan studied this form extensively, but I would argue that he made use of it during his final assault against Darth Maul, or, at least, a more aggressive system of Ataru. The one gaping weakness of Kenobi's form, especially for those who are familiar with his abilities as a master, was his defensive capabilities. It's something he would not take up until after witnessing the failings of Ataru against Darth Maul. Before that point, he relied on his sheer vigor, which often was enough for the enemies he and his masters faced in the past. Yet during their fight with the Sith Lord, Kenobi was constantly getting tagged during his defensive lapses. There is some credit for Kenobi's use of the sixth form of lightsaber combat, Niman, also known as the moderation form. One of its most basic sequences was the pushing slash technique, which Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Ahsoka have all used. But by no stretch of the imagination does this make them masters, not even intermediate practitioners of the form. As stated by Battlemaster Sandralig, the study of the form took at least 10 years to master, and each Padawan's use of this singular technique from Form 6 was merely an adoption, rather than a dedicated expression of its study. All said, by the end of his apprenticeship, Obi-Wan was not a master of any one form, yet proficient with Ataru and Shien. His general method of strategy, like most young Jedi, was to impose his physical will with very little moderation. The best example of this was against Darth Maul, who he and his master simply could not penetrate, as Maul just dug in his heels and waited for their separation and their fatigue to set in. Yet it should be noted that Kenobi performed much better during his rage-induced assault against Darth Maul, finally landing his own blows, though it ultimately did not win him the straight-up bout, and in fact, Maul was able to feed on his emotion and gain the upper hand. Like Kenobi, Anakin began his lightsaber training with Ataru, but the fifth form is what really called to him. In a practical sense, the Shien variant was suited for blaster deflection, yet it was the maxim of Jim-So, peace, through superior firepower, that Anakin valued. The form was marked by strength-based counterattack, defending against lightsaber strikes, but retaliating with brutal cleaves and crosscuts. As literally noted by Anakin Skywalker within the Jedi Path, he also dabbled in Iman, beyond the fundamental use of the pushing slash method, practicing the twin blade technique as a lesson of control. Anakin's combative training culminates in his performance against Count Dooku and Asajj Ventress. It's worth noting how much better Anakin performed against Dooku as opposed to his master. Where Dooku was able to easily bat Obi-Wan away, even taking the time to admonish Kenobi's performance, Skywalker constantly surprised Dooku, whether by way of his twin blade technique or his inherent reflexes and timing. At first, Dooku could find no chink in Skywalker's form, but Anakin's use of Ataru and Jim-So depleted too much energy, and he started to overextend himself, caught at the arm by Dooku's lightsaber. This would become less of a factor in his fight with Ventress, where he was able to better contend with the assassin's dual blade style, eventually overwhelming her through a war of attrition and pure strength. But he still had defensive lapses, disarmed several times throughout the duel. Of the three, Ahsoka Tano was perhaps the most proficient in her use of Ataru. Again, like many Padawans, she drifted to the acrobatic form, but unlike Anakin, she stuck with it as a primary form. She fully embodied the full form of Ataru, not only by way of her lightsaber movesets or her acrobatic somersaults, but the use of her entire body as a weapon. As previously stated, she was quite skilled with her unarmed martial arts, and to me, this derived from Ataru's discipline. And she supplemented this with the Jarkai variant of the form, wielding a standard lightsaber and a Shoto lightsaber in a dual blade tandem. The only thing that kept her from high proficiency with the form was a more disciplined and subdued version of the style, which she very nearly had. That all said, Ahsoka was not an Ataru purist, adopting other styles of combat to color her use of the technique, such as the quarterstaff training of Niman, the blaster deflection of Form 5, and the unorthodox reverse grip of Shien. While I am far less critical of Ahsoka's grip than Ready 4, I do see it as limiting in the context of a one-to-one duel. But the style itself has shown to be effective throughout the Star Wars lore, as displayed by characters like Quinlan Vos and Galen Merrick. One sacrifices reach for more speed and rapid crosscuts. Obviously this makes more sense for Shoto, her secondary blade, but less so with her primary weapon. Another detraction is that it sacrifices strength, which is already a disadvantage for a dual-blade Ataru specialist. Still, I do think this all plays into Ahsoka's overall mentality in a fight, and what has shaped her as a duelist. Her advantages were always by way of her speed. She knew reach and leverage would never be a viable option, nor strength or power blows, so she adopted an acrobatic and speed-based style that would help her breach an opponent's defensive bubble. See for instance, her fight with Pre Vizsla, where she used her superior agility to breach his guard. But against enemies who can match her speed, or were simply more skilled, like General Grievous, Asajj Ventress, or Barriss Offee, her disadvantages became more apparent. Nevertheless, Ahsoka's dueling abilities had a strong foundation and infrastructure that would one day be worthy of masters. A lightsaber duel between this trio would be a dance of a swan and dragons. Anakin and Obi-Wan's styles were very comparable, though I would say Anakin has showcased a fair bit more skill and the capacity to apply it, but I do feel Ahsoka may be the weakest duelist of the three, not for lack of talent or training, but a disadvantage of preference. she definitely would have an easier time defending against the pair, especially with her dual blade defense, coupled with her evasion tactics. But eventually, by way of Anakin or Obi-Wan, she will be worn down. In the context of a three-way fight, I actually do think she would hold out, but when looking purely at combative technique and who is more favorable against each other in the specific, singular round, I would say she falls off first. With regards to Kenobi and Skywalker, as already suggested within Anakin's breakdown, I feel the Chosen One was already on par with Attack of the Clones Kenobi. Their fighting styles, and even their mentalities were similar, but I feel there is a skill gap between the two. It's true that Obi-Wan finally did contend with Maul, but this was after being amplified by his master's death. Beforehand, as described in the novelization, neither he nor his master were a match for Darth Maul. By contrast, Anakin stood his ground against one of the greatest duelists of his time. It's true he was overconfident in his abilities, and his assertion that he already rivaled Yoda was unfounded, but his skill was present, and it would take more than the capabilities of a Padawan Kenobi to undermine his conceit. Anakin Skywalker gets the edge for his dueling abilities. The path to knighthood is different for each Jedi. Obi-Wan was built during a time of peace, Ahsoka was molded during a time of war, and Anakin was shaped by a bit of both. They all eventually ended up as very different people. One rose, one fell, and one departed. But as their growth related to their combative prowess, if these three met in conflict, who would win? Let's set up this fight. Let's say it takes place in the Jedi Temple's sparring arena. The following is a hypothetical explanation of the possible outcomes. First, let's look at the early fight. As all participants usually open their fights with swordplay, I would say they would engage in a lightsaber duel. Anakin will be first in the fray. More often than not, he would engage with Kenobi, who would likely meet him head-on. Ahsoka would engage as well, poking and piercing at each of the other's flanks. Kenobi would likely parry and turn her strikes aside, but Anakin would respond with several Jimso counterattacks, warding Tano off. Ahsoka would defend against them both, putting her dual blade sabers to work, intercepting Obi-Wan's cleaves, and dodging Anakin's crosscuts. For this early fight, I see it as a split. Each fighter was somewhat aggressive, with Ahsoka being the least hostile. Because of this, I think she would earn an early advantage by piercing Anakin or Obi-Wan as they focus their attention on one another. But more than likely, it would be Kenobi who would get hit, as Anakin's reflexes and combative intuition would not be easily penetrated. Plus, he could retaliate, taking Tano out in the process, giving him an advantage. Kenobi does not have an advantage in this early fight. If he faced Ahsoka on his own, he would not have too much of an issue, but Anakin would be a handful, keeping him busy, possibly opening him up to an Ahsoka sideswipe, and I've not seen anything from him that would suggest he could prevent this. But if Anakin is taken out of the picture by Tano, either temporarily or permanently, I see him having a dedicated dueling advantage against Ahsoka. Regardless, I very much doubt this matchup would end so early. The mid-fight would see some force powers come into play, and I feel this is where Ahsoka would be better suited because of her battlefield experience, dealing with multiple enemies at once. With this, I can see her disrupting Kenobi's balance and tempo, either opening an attack for Anakin or removing him from the fight entirely. If her attacks were focused on Skywalker, again, Anakin would react, showcasing his superior use of the Force, either by way of a straight telekinetic push or a thrown object. Whichever the case, I think Ahsoka has the best advantage, simply because of the three-way dynamic. Because Anakin and Obi-Wan's sensibilities line up so close, they would focus most of their attention on one another, giving Ahsoka the opportunity to employ her own advantage. And I do not believe Kenobi would cope, less equipped than Ahsoka, and less talented than Anakin. Whether defeated by Anakin or Ahsoka, I see him falling out of the fight at this point. With Kenobi gone, Anakin will be able to focus on Ahsoka, and the fight would look a lot like his bout with Asajj Ventress. It's possible he would take some blows from Ahsoka, whether by physical kicks or a straight force push, but Anakin would take the damage. Ahsoka would put up a fight, mostly because of her superior agility, but Anakin would be more than a match for her. Where Ventress could contend with Anakin because of her skillful blade work and ingenious use of the Force, Ahsoka could not do the same, never displaying the same skill with her swordplay, nor her use of the Force. Her advantage would be her agility, but that advantage would not be significant enough to breach the gap. Anakin's advantages were too many and too robust. In the late fight, Anakin would take a 3-to-1 advantage over Tano. His strength-based Jimso would break Ahsoka's Ataru, and Ahsoka's speed would not match Anakin's reflex and natural ability. If the fight did turn into a battle of the Force, Anakin has also showcased a superior talent, either stonewalling Ahsoka's assault and returning the favor twice over, or using the environment to throw the young Togruta off, bringing his overall total to 5 out of 10 victories, with Ahsoka at 4 out of 10 victories, and Kenobi with 1 out of 10 victories. Of all the scenarios, I see this fight ending somewhere between the mid and late fight. The early fight would have no apparent victor, but Ahsoka's battlefield experience would manage the group fight a bit better in the mid-game. Kenobi would put up a fight, but would not be able to stand up to the combined efforts of each fighter, as he did not have Ahsoka's twin blade training, nor her agility, or Anakin's sheer tenacity and skill. Once Anakin had Ahsoka alone, his advantages would become very apparent. And though Tano's superior agility would make her a hard target to pin down, he would get the job done, much faster than he did with Ventress on Yavin 4. And thus, if I were a betting man, my bets would be on Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, as the victor. Of course, this is all my opinion, based on my interpretation of the lore. Do you agree that Padawan Anakin would take a majority against Padawan Kenobi and Tano? Or do you believe an advantage lies elsewhere? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, peace, love, and may the Force be with you. Always.
Just really wanted to show how deadly the weapon could be.
Time periods. Through strife and turmoil, they both led successful careers, becoming the best bounty hunters of the Old Republic and the Galactic Empire.
Of the dark side.
Like this guy, what is he doing? Stop shooting at me. I'm a lightsaber wielding foe. Don't.
Ooh, man, hot. Hot. Daddy, it's hot. Cookies for people who get that reference. The Jedi Path was truly an arduous affair. Oh my God.